engines, it's time for RuPaul's Pod Race, a queer Star Wars podcast. This week, we have a very special returning guest, author Emma Mieko Candon, who you may know from our episode on the Star Wars Visions Ronin novel. We brought them on to discuss their debut original novel, The Archive Undying, that we read when it came out and we feel very insane about. Specifically, me and Noah feel very insane about. That's who you have with here today. If you haven't already read it, pause, go read it, come back. This is going to be very spoiler-filled. My name is Klaudia. My pronouns are she, her, and you can find me on social media at Klaudia Says, K-A-L-U-D-I-A Says. My gender this week is Sunai's little spice rack. I just think it's neat that whenever he is stressed, he's like, I need to cook. Okay, Breaking Bad. Like, I need to cook, and I
all
have
right.
my... I just thought of that Lios we need to cook meme. That's literally Sunai when he's stressed. He's like, Lios, we need to cook. Like, he's so senshi coded when you think about it. Anyways,
I think we'll later talk about how central food is to this novel, but like food is present. Food is thematic. Anyway, I'm Noah. My pronouns are he, him. You can find me on social media pretty much anywhere at the Jewish Jedi. And my gender this week is Iterate Fractal's special little boy, which I think is an adequate summary of the main character of this book, Sunai, who I hold very dearly in my heart.
he is so capital C character. Like,
He
I
really
love
is.
that boy.
If you want to talk about capital D, capital Q, disaster queers, and you look it up in the dictionary, it's Sunai's portrait. Like, that's who's there. And I'm very excited we get to talk about him today.
I'm honestly so touched. Because I did it on purpose and he just got worse with every draft. But hi, I'm Emma, pronouns she, they. You can technically find me on social media on mostly just sitting on my accounts. On X, Twitter, it is Emma Candon, and everywhere else it is EM Candon. And yeah, today my gender is fun size exaltation in perpetuity, which come join the book. That's the kind of thing I call robots.
I love
the alternative.
that one's name. I love their name so much. Every time I would see it in the book, well, I've listened to the book actually, I would be like, tee-hee.
Yeah.
Like, every time I'd be like,
Yeah. I find naming things excruciatingly difficult, which is why the only time I really enjoy naming things is when I get to name them shit like that.
Did you have an alternate gender for us? Because I know you have a backup gender.
Oh, right. Yeah, I know I did. Because everyone likes the fun size joke. So everyone's always gravitating toward it. So my alternative is God's little joke, which is, God's favorite chew toy. That is exactly what Sunai is.
And it's kind of what the book is about. Literally. I mean, he's called.
Yeah, exactly.
It's called the Maw. It's literally God's favorite chew toy.
Yeah, man. When at the New York book launch thing, someone asked me which character I would save from a house fire, and to my vague horror, I just spat out the Maw. It's like, Maw doesn't need saving, but also it's baby.
That's so bad of you.
I mean, technically, if you did leave Sunai in a house fire, he'd be mostly fine. He'd be okay. He'd be a little traumatized, but it's like, okay, what's a grain of sand in a desert? He's totally fine.
He'll make it.
So a little thing that we like to do on our series RuPaul's Day Off is we like to give a little pitch, a little summary. Who may not have consumed this thing about why they should. What's it about? What should they know? That is spoiler free, so you can listen to this portion and then leave and then come back. So Emma, as our special guest, would you like to give your little 30-second pitch, couple sentences pitch of what the hell is the Archive Undying and why should you care?
Immortal Twink gets possessed by a series of divine AIs, alive and dead, and uses them to 1, get laid, and 2, upend apocalyptic cycles. Also, the robots are giant and made of coral and bones and glass and all sorts of weird shit.
That is a really good name for a manhwa, in my opinion. That's a perfect length, to be honest.
That short paragraph is the title of the book.
That's that's pretty accurate.
It's just the genre.
Yeah, it's really just Tsunai's no good, very bad day all the time. Well, and Vayati, you know what? He's suffering a lot too. we don't discuss that enough because he's just there. I mean, he's not just there. He's also just there being down bad all the time. Like, we get it. You're gay. Anyways, so when we were talking earlier, we were mentioning various pieces of media that I am obsessed with, like Trigun. And I said that Tsunai is one of my favorite characters. He goes in my capital C character pile along with people like Nicholas D. Wolfwood. And there are a lot of pieces of media that I think people would mention that this book reminds them of, but I wanted to ask, what are some pieces of media that, like, either deliberately or like or just you realized a bit later inspired the world, inspired any of the characters, like, or was there no inspiration from anything else and it was just an amalgamation?
Yeah. So like Wolfwood came up because like when you mentioned that, I was like, oh yeah, Wolfwood was one of Baby's first Blorbos. I was definitely deeply into the original Trigun when it first came out stateside. But yeah, so like the very, very first version of this book was writing that was done exclusively for my wife, of the sort where like I give it to her with no intentions of it ever going anywhere else. Um, and it was a Pacific Rim AU of a novel we had been working on together at the time that was very East Asian flavored fantasy. And the idea was that like I watched Pacific Rim and thought that was great and not weird enough. So I turned the Jaegers were made out of the bones and the flesh of dead kaiju. And you could, in order to pilot them, you didn't just have to be drift compatible. You also had to have like some sort of infection from that kaiju. So, that really is a lot of the basic anatomy of what's weird in this book, metaphysically, with these characters we call relics. But the thing I would say is less intentional about like that original anatomy of the story was that it was being written at a time when I had just sort of been tipped headfirst into understanding why Clamp is good, where Clamp is like this team of manga artists and writers who have worked for decades together. They've made things like Card Captor Sakura, which is very fundamentally sweet, and also X 1999 and Tokyo Babylon, which are just deeply insane. And I had also just like binge read Tokyo, not Tokyo, Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle. And I was just like finally understanding these things that my friends had been obsessed with when I was a teenager. And I had just like not really understood, but I was like, oh, melodrama's good. So that was definitely just there in my mind when I first wrote that little bit. But when I actually picked up this AU that I had written and started like changing it around to turn it into a real book, that was around 4 years later. And the two pieces of media that had saturated my brain at the time were one, Rogue One, which was like the first Star Wars that felt like recognizably mine, that I had experienced in a really long time. And I think a huge part of that was that when we first met Baze and Chirut, I think I actually started crying in the theater because it was the first time I had seen like East Asian characters in a Star Wars. And I had been obsessed with Star Wars since I was like 7, but it was a very deeply affecting emotionally in a way where I was like, oh. And I think I probably mentioned this in the Ronin episode because like that was the moment when I first physically understood what the word representation means, because I had kind of like intellectually understood it and been like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, I'm a multiply marginalized person. I get it. But like, oh, now I get it. It's in my bones. It's happening to me right now. But I also really my favorite part of Star Wars is when it's like grimy and kind of impossible. Like things just don't feel good. So Rogue One is perfect for me. And then the other thing was that I had been listening to a lot of real play podcast called Friends at the Table, and they had this season called Counterweight, which was mechs and weird mechs, and it's like Cowboy Bebop with um, some kind of Evangelion vibes. Also a little Star Warsy, and I just loved it so much, and it got me through a lot of the medical problems I was experiencing at the time. Um, but yeah, that was all of what was in my brain when I first started actually working on Archive as a book.
As soon as you said clamp, I was like, yep, that makes sense. I see it now. I was like, I've connected the dots. Yeah. No, but that, when you said that mix of things, I went, yeah, exactly. I can definitely see that. Like every single thing, especially Rogue One, maybe like with the scrappy little crew. A scrappy little crew who's like, do we trust each other? Who can say? I see you. Like,
Yeah, I might have mentioned even in Ronin at the time because Archive wasn't out then, so I had to be kind of vague, but I fully wrote Archive like in the draft that it was eventually published. One of the things on my mind was like, write this in a way that convinces them to let you write a Star Wars book one day. And part of that was like, write a scrappy little crew in a horrible little boat.
I mean,
the third scrap is a horrible little boat, like at the end of the day. But it's our horrible little boat.
Exactly.
I love how they're like, yeah, they just constantly are patching that shit up. Like, I'm like, okay, Millennium Falcon. Like,
honestly, if the third scrap were as functional as the Millennium Falcon, a lot of the problems in this book could have been avoided.
True.
I love what my favorite things about Star Wars is that shit just breaks.
Yeah.
And like, okay, you have to live with that now.
And you're in space. You're like, fuck. Like,
yeah. No, I also like your mention of like this idea that like the Jaegers being made out of like kaiju parts. I think one of the things like really aesthetically about this book that I found, like, because I love body horror and I love like this kind of like mutation sort of aspect of like where we'll talk about this in a bit, but like where your personhood ends and other things sort of begin. So when in Archive it's established that like, yes, you are in a big robot, but this big robot is built from the corpse of your god, like, and you're now having to sit inside it. It was crazy. And it actually brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you. So you meditate a lot on bodies throughout the entirety of this book. I think it's one of the most pervasive themes. They're treated as sort of simultaneously prisons, property, and personhood at all different points, sometimes all at the same time. And I was curious if this was a theme that you like set out to explore when you were writing this book, or if it's more something like as you were writing it, you were like, I seem to have a lot of thoughts on bodies and like the boundaries between them, because it definitely comes out, but I'm curious how like deliberate that was in the writing process.
I would say it was mostly not deliberate, but kind of inevitable for a couple different reasons. Actually, I'm going to try and list the 3 reasons so I don't forget any of them. One of them is that I did a lot of anthropology in undergrad, and the thing I really got fixated on by the end of it was the anthropology of the body. So I have a lot of thoughts about it. And that intersects with identity and also health and psychology. 2, the thing is that like every robot and especially every mech story is inevitably a metaphor about bodies. And so if you do mechs, you're going to be talking about bodies. And I kind of like dug that pit for myself even deeper at the beginning by going, they're made out of like things that used to be people. And the third thing is that I didn't realize this until like a couple drafts in. And this is the silly thing, but like I started writing this in the direct aftermath of major surgery, which was sort of like the last huge thing that was done to my body to fix it after it sort of like tried to fall apart in 2012. So 5 years later in 2017, I'm getting my hips replaced. I'm getting treatment for some like really kind of profound lung problems I have. And as I'm like working through recovery, I find myself drawing on, like memories I have of the months I spent in the ICU and all this other stuff that had happened to me. And, sometime about a year and a half into drafting, I go, oh, it's about bodies. It's about recovery from it's about surviving incredible bodily trauma, and the way that's reshaped both my health and my mind and my relationships with other people. So, in one part, inevitable because it's been a long-standing interest of mine. Another part inevitable because of the metaphor I chose, and a third part inevitable because of the time at which I started writing it.
Yeah, no, I see that a lot throughout like this book. And one interesting thing that this isn't really a question, but it kind of like builds off this is like there's a sort of semi-constant discourse of like can there people who are like you can't be disabled and also be in fantasy and sci-fi, and I found it such like a wonderful sort of stab at that concept of like Sunai is immortal, he is unkillable, he is also a disabled man, like and his body, despite being able to seemingly repair itself from anything, is also not able to repair itself from everything. Which I don't know. I found that really interesting in this book about, giant robots and empire and just a lot of gay sex. You also have this like very interesting thing of like, you carry this with you. And so I thought it was really cool to sort of like focus on that through him as a character.
Yeah, that was actually extremely deliberate because, like, by that point, I was like, there were some things that were like, I think his limp was there from day one, his glasses were there from day one, but like, I really started leaning into that and making a point of it, because, uh, you know, one, as someone who by the time they were like really writing this was physically disabled in kind of a profound way, um, and especially once I realized like there was a lot about chronic illness that was embedded in this narrative. uh so there's like two layers of disability there, right? Because like one is um he needs glasses, and he grew up in a society where there was kind of a body horror god king who would give you probably any physical surgery that you wanted just because. And like, imagine being trans in that kingdom. That would actually be kind of great. But he just didn't want anything done to his eyes. He just chose that, and that was fine. So that's one thing he's living with and carrying forward, just like something that would be conceived of as a disability that he just didn't care to do anything about. But the other thing is he has that limp because it was an injury he sustained right before this transformation occurred. So it is a thing that happened to him. It was a disability that occurred that is now permanent because of what is legibly a superpower. But he also has to live with the fact that his ankle will literally never heal. And I think by the end of the book, I was sitting there going like, I guess technically he could heal that, but I kind of it didn't feel right. So like, right, this is deep spoilers, friends. If you haven't stopped listening now, you really should go away because it's like in the last couple pages. I made a decision for while his leg is physically healed, like the limp remains coded into his brain in some ways. So it's like a phantom limp that just won't go away. And I think it's a valid question to ask whether he's clinging to that and just like needs it to remain true about himself, or whether it's some other kind of like neurological scar or whatever. But yeah, no, that was all really on purpose.
I love that because there are, it always reminds me hashtag chronic illness moment, when I go to the doctor about a very specific thing. I go to a specialist for a very specific thing, and they're like, oh, like, how was it? I've had to switch specialists a bunch of times for the neurological thing that I have, and I'll have to do like the whole spiel, the spiel that you have to give. You have to give the whole explanation. And I'll go and I'll give the whole explanation, whatever. And then I'll be like, oh, but this thing was from before. I had this before. Just to let you know, I had this thing before. When they were like, oh, like, was your vision always? I was like, let me be clear. My vision was always pretty bad. But then I lost half my optic nerve, so like that made it work. Like, let me be clear. This was from the before times. I want to make it clear, and I think write that down. So I always found that part very, very funny with Sunai. Also, that's so Vash the Stampede coded of him. What do you mean he can heal from bullet wounds, but he still has no arm? That's crazy.
Oh my god, literally didn't even think about that. The things that are being revealed to me now about like, oh, fuck me. Okay, yeah.
At the end of the day, Trigun, am I right? No, that's a sickness. I have to be called out and stopped. I mean, that is probably one of the biggest themes in this book, and it's one I know that you've talked about a lot. But if there's like one thing you would want a reader to like take away from this book, or even if there isn't, and you're just like, take whatever the fuck you want, I don't care. But if there's like one thing you would want a reader to like take away from this, what would it be?
I do think it would be related to scars and how they're really so much an indication of life persisting. And because like I feel in a lot of ways this book is about a character who is immortal and kind of fucked up about it. The idea is like learning how to endure surviving. Because I don't think I've really talked about this much. A lot of like the emotional processing I had to do about the fact that my body had tried so goddamn hard to die for multiple years was that I did lose a childhood friend to cancer within about a year of starting to work on Archive. And that just fucking wrecked me in a way that I was completely blindsided by. And at one point, like, I have a memory of my mother asking, like, do you think it's survivor's guilt? And I was like, no, it's not. And I would still call it not. But it was still like reckoning with the magnitude of surviving and how it just changes you as a person completely. Like there were doors that were closed to me after I was sick and I was still alive. And there were other doors that remained open and other doors that had only been a little bit open that I could choose to honor and respect in new ways that were ultimately extremely good for me as a human being. And one of them was writing. Like I didn't respect the fact that I liked writing until after I got sick. But yeah, I would say the thing that I kind of hope is embedded in this book that people can take with them is the idea that if you are alive, that is a thing to be cherished. And that it is valuable to find people who will cherish that for you.
I feel like that's one of my favorite things about like examinations of immortal characters, when they have to like sit with that. Another reason why watching Frieren may be very difficult for the both of you, I'm just letting you know. If these are personal themes to you, they will upset you. I'm just warning you both on a personal level. As you were saying that, I went, uh-oh.
I love that we're both getting a emotional warning for watching Frieren.
Not like for Frieren, it is. I had a similar experience where I had a friend who recently passed and it was very sudden, who I played D&D with. So then I watched Frieren and I was like, oh shit. Cause it is about losing the friends that you played in your party with. And I was like, fuck. So that was a lot. So yeah, I'm just warning you, whatever. But in general, I find immortal characters to be fascinating. Me and Noah will always disagree on this, whatever, but for me, like, immortality is horrifying to me. It is the reason why, like, the end of Trigun Maximum, for example, I find to be like, I have like beef with. I'm like, it's horrifying to me. I'm like, what do you mean he has to live immortally forever alone? Like, that's the end. Are you fucking kidding me? So I guess spoilers for Trigun Maximum. But like, so when that was introduced for Sunai, and you're talking about kind of processing the sort of emotions of like, I have to go on now. I'm different and I have to go on now without other people. I was like, oh, well, those are my favorite special little guys. Every time, that's probably why when as a teenager and when I watched Doctor Who and I was like, this has changed me a lot. We won't examine that now.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting because I think I am in the like immortality is like existential horror camp.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, and it's funny because I'll say things like I'll never write this kind of character because I find this trope annoying in some way. And like immortality is kind of one of them because I would prefer to treat it as something that would be kind of a thing to wrestle with if you had not come come into existence as so eldritch that it would simply be normal to you. That if you were a human who experienced it suddenly, it would be a thing that you had to reckon with. And so, like, it was a little surprising to me to realize I had like written myself into that trope and gone, oh, okay, well, at least I'm doing it in a way that feels correct to my feelings about it. Because if I have beef with the trope, then yeah, I should write about it and explain why I have beef to myself so that I can actually reckon it.
Well, I think it's interesting too for Sunai specifically because like by the very nature of his immortal existence, his whole like culture and literal like place of living had to have been obliterated for him to be as he is now. So like not only is he sort of stuck throwing himself at life, which we see him doing in the beginning of the book, like he literally is just like, I'll do whatever, I don't care. Um, but he also like is forever distanced from like the people that he used to be a part of. And every single day is like a living reminder of that. I found that like really interesting. I do also find it interesting though because he starts the book being like, I don't need anyone. I'm alone. I'm a loner. And the minute that he meets Vayati, he's like, I have to have him. Like we have to be best friends forever. Which like I feel like is actually so like real and true of him emotionally because I imagine you're wandering for decades of time and you're like, I don't need anyone, and then it's like one person's like, how are you doing, and he's like, oh my god, finally someone asked. I love that about the two of them.
He's
Yeah.
I love how he's just so like every time he's like, oh, it's horrible, this is terrible, I can't be close to someone, and then like but then like he'll do things or say things or people will talk about him and they're like, oh yeah, you know, everybody knows this guy, he's great, whatever, and like he's so personable and everybody likes him and whatever, and I'm like, so you're just lying to yourself. Okay, King.
He's very, very sure that by like maintaining an affable persona, he can actually keep internal distance, which I think is a thing that a lot of people can probably relate to if they are marginalized in some way, where it's the sense of like, oh yeah, you get to know me in my friendly space, but you don't know any of the fifis that are going on the inside. And I think for him that is fairly true. And then he trips into Vayati, who's like, hey, I'm going to call you on your bullshit constantly. And it's a disaster instantly.
And he has a nickname for him. He's like, oh, we're just hooking up. Why do you have a nickname for him? Why do you as a man have a nickname for another man that you just said you're just hooking up with? Why are you calling him a pet name? Answer quickly, Sunai.
It's a well, how okay, I want to phrase this in a particular way. I have an idea. It is something he is doing in an attempt to disorient Vayati and take control of the situation that goes very badly wrong.
I feel like that is truly their entire dynamic, because he'll be like, no, I'm pushing you away, and Vayati will be like, I find that attractive.
Yeah, exactly.
He's like everything he did, like, who's at the time when he's like, no, like, you need to get out of here because like it's unsafe for you, whatever, and Vayati's like, oh, you're such a compassionate and nice person, I love that, I'll be staying.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I love it too because he's like, I don't need him. We're just screwing, like it's not a big deal. And then he proceeds to probe the entire crew of the third scrap about his lore. They're like, why do you want to know about this? He's like, no reason. Duh. Just like walks away. I'm obsessed with those two. I think they're so. One thing I think is interesting about this book is like it's queer in the sense of like there's a lot of gay people, which there are. I just want to advertise this now. If you're looking for books that have a lot of gay people in them, this is a book for you. There are homosexuals have run amok. They're everywhere. Um, but I also think, interestingly enough, it's queer in like the academic sense. I think a lot of what this book does is it kind of, not to like turn us all the way back to bodies, but like it kind of does queer the body as like an object and as like a thing. Um, you did like a book launch event in Boston. Was that what that was? A book event? I don't know.
Technically, it's a book tour, so there were a bunch of like books. I did a book tour. Still wild to say that, but I did do it. But yeah, I stopped by in Boston.
Yeah. So
And you were there.
I was
Hello.
there. Yeah, which was really funny because I asked a question and then after I like went up to get my copy signed and you were like, I know your voice from somewhere. But you mentioned this text at that the Cyborg Manifesto, which is an academic paper. Which if you haven't read, dear listeners, I would say read it. It is a very interesting paper. Um, I was reading it earlier in preparation for this, but I think that this is a really interesting excerpt. It reads, in the traditions of Western science and politics, the tradition of racist male-dominant capitalism, the tradition of progress, the tradition of appropriation of nature as a resource for the productions of culture, the tradition of reproduction of the self from reflections of the other, the relation between organism and machine has been a border war. I think that that sort of thematically pops up in Archive so often, especially when characters who are human start to both mentally and physically blend with machines. And earlier you were talking about this idea of like, okay, what if the Jaegers were made of kaiju? What if they were like pieces of the dead, essentially? Um, and when you were thinking about this concept, did you know you were like, I want to put a little guy in a big bone robot and shake him around and see what happens? And like, I guess my question is more, what kind of like themes and ideas were you considering when you were thinking about this blending between the dead and the robotic and the live and the organic?
I think it comes partly from the fact that the Cyborg Manifesto, in my understanding of it, and it's been years since I read it, but there's just sort of like the things it's telling me that still live in my brain, is that the delineation between person and extension of person through tool or robot is an illusion because it's an extension of your personhood through that thing. You're exerting yourself through that thing. When I first read the Cyborg Manifesto, I immediately went and wrote a paper on how the internet is an expression of selfhood. And it is, and it's deranged, but that's what it is. And social media is terrifying. But uh, so when I was writing this, like all that's in my head, and there's sort of an assumption that um, for me, the dangerous thing in these relics and these AIs that have been fragmented and have rescued a part of themselves by like burrowing into a living person who then is reconnected to their old flesh in the idea of like, and now we will control this thing through the human being, is that it necessarily involves the sort of like breakdown of barriers between identities because that fragment of a dead AI is not dead so long as it is inside this person. And this person is able to synthesize and synergize with the remains of this machine that's been rebuilt because they are now a relic. They are a living legacy of that thing that came before. And it all gets bound up in the fact that, like I'm of the school that the self is fragmentary and instantaneous. So the you that existed at breakfast is not the you that exists now. They are part of a lineage, but they are technically distinct because the self is not like a consistent thing. It's a thing that manifests from moment to moment, blah, 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 blah. I know I'm getting a little abstract, but these are all the things that are feeding into the way I write.
And we love that. Let me
Well,
clear. And we love
yeah.
that.
I mean, you can really like you really get into that abstraction aspect, especially during some of like the later portions of the book. Like, there's this. I remember, so I finished this book. I was lucky to get an early reader copy, so thank you again for that because this book is so amazing to me. But I was reading it on the train back from Western Massachusetts. I lived in Boston at this time, and I was taking the train back. And I'm sitting here reading this book, and I'm like, no one around me knows what is going on in my brain right now, because it's like there's a section where it's like Sunai throws a punch, and he sees that Vayati, the Ma, Iterate Fractal, the passenger, and himself have all thrown a punch, and they have simultaneously hit Iterate Fractal, the Ma, the passenger, Sunai, and Vayati. Like, identity literally, like, it doesn't even so much fracture as it becomes fluid. So it was really cool to like see you explore that through the lens of giant robots punching each other. I love that. I was like, yeah, let's have complex ruminations on personal identity and individuality, but let's do it with big robots that are made of dead bones.
I mean, and I truly do see the DNA specifically of Pacific Rim in that, because I remember I was there when the Deep Magic was written, when Pacific Rim came out. What Pacific Rim did to not just its own fandom, but all fandom in general, the creativity that came out of that. And there, you are not the only author I have heard be like, yes, I was inspired by Pacific Rim, or what I wrote was initially a Pacific Rim fan fiction, or whatever. Like, something about that, people went, wait, this has made me think about what it means to, like, in that case, relationships between people and personhood and whatever. But like, whatever the idea of, like, especially drift compatibility, it was like dropping a bomb on the internet. Like, it was like, after that, we were different people. And like, creatively, any person who has ever written a story was like, I'm a different person now. And I could see it from there. And like, I think that was one of the things that like made that movie stand out, was like, yeah, it's about like giant robots, sure, and like they're fighting each other and like kaiju, whatever. But what is it really about? What is it really, like, you know, what does it mean to be an individual person when you're drift compatible with another person enough to pilot a robot? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And also, they're like two little gay ass scientists.
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like I should note that, like, Pacific Rim was also the first movie I saw in theaters after I first got sick.
Really?
So, you know, it's like in the DNA also of like the whole, and I rewatched it within the last year. Like, I have a little writing coven that I get to hang out with every once in a while here, and it's fantastic, and I love them very much. And we like had a movie night recently where we watched Pacific Rim, and I was like kind of awestruck because I had forgotten the degree to which it's also a movie about physical recovery. Because literally in the first scene, one of those Jaegers gets completely wrecked. One brother's dead, the other one is physically disabled, and he has to learn how to live again through the context of another person. I went like, oh fuck, it's Archive.
I mean, Guillermo del Toro, your mind has inspired thousands. I don't know who on that producing team thought that idea up, but your mind has inspired millions even. I sometimes I think about that movie and I'm like, oh, so we've never but returned to cinema again. Also, that being the first movie you saw back, that's crazy. That's taste and that's class. So you already asked that question. So I know that it's developed over time. It started out as just a thing you wanted to write for your wife. But is there anything about the Archive Undying or the Archive Undying and its sequel, the Dawnworld sequence, that's like changed over time in its development? Like, can you tell us anything about, I mean, you've already told us a little bit, but like, can you tell us anything about, like, was there anything in its original concept that has like changed a lot, or something that's like always been the same, or anything about that development process?
I think a lot of the world has actually been pretty consistent. Like, if anything, there have been things that have been stripped out to just like make it a little cleaner. Like, there used to be a lot more like political conflict between the harbor and other AI held states that mattered, and now that really doesn't matter anymore. There was a lot of stuff going on in Kuonmo that was like layers of people who have different opinions about how they should integrate the harbor into their lives. And that got a lot more slimmed down and focused, because it's a book where I'm doing a lot of stuff and juggling a lot of plates, and we had to narrow down what plates to focus on. So I think the thing that's changed most is that when I was first writing Sunai and Vayade, they almost like had opposite affect. Because like Audie comes off as like kind of very quiet, right? He's very controlled. And then like you get to know him and you're like, oh, his apartment is a disaster. This man is gonna straight up just eat that onion. And it's very troubling. And then you meet Sunai and you're like, that man has not slept in a bed in 3 months. And I think if you presented him with one, he would crawl under it and curl up there. So they had when I started out, Sunai had like what I call accountant energy. He was a lot more like believably a former monk. And then you would get to know him and you'd be like, oh, he's deeply unhinged. And meanwhile, Audie was in a phase where he was just like, I am stuck with the harbor and acting out about it constantly. So yeah, they just at some point they traded vibes.
I love that.
Yeah.
I see now. I want more things from Audie's perspective because I know it's crazy inside that brain. I know it's wild in there.
Oh, that poor man.
What's going on? He fascinates me. Well, you did say this is one of my other questions, so that's why I'm going to bring it up. But you did say that there were various things that you had to cut out. Is there anything that you had to cut out that like you're like, I still miss that? Like, what was your like favorite thing that you had to cut out, if you can tell us?
The thing that I had to cut out that I can tell you about because it's probably never going to manifest is that I love a mean robot. It's like one of the reasons I love K2, like Rogue One is K2SO. Like, oh, I have a new droid Blorbo. Hooray. But I had this character who was a relic, but kind of was a robot still, like a frag tech that was person sized, which is like kind of anathema in this world because there's this belief that AIs should present themselves as inhumanly large to correctly represent how much power they hold over human beings. And to be small is therefore like morally improper in some way. So this was a human-sized robot that was technically a frag, but technically a relic. It had named itself Buddy. And I love Buddy, but I don't think Buddy exists anymore, even in like any version of this world, because of the things I've done with like where Buddy came from and like what Buddy's whole deal was. I've changed too much for Buddy to exist. So I'll find a home for Buddy one day, but it's not going to be an archive.
R.I.P. Buddy, you'll be missed.
No, literally. I'm just thinking about a K2SO or like a Chopper type here. You know what? If Chopper had been there, the book would have been this long. The harbor would be gone. The book would be this long, and
I am also just like I am fascinated by the concept of person-sized frag tech because like so many of the times that the frag tech appears, it's like here is a robot that has horrifyingly contorted itself into like a kind of animal shape, but also kind of not, and it does want you dead. And I love the idea of there being like a person size. It's like, no, I'm like really chill. I even gave myself this cute human name, Buddy, so you guys will like trust and vibe with me. Like, just by comparison, because the other frag tech is like it's monstrous. And as a big fan of creature design and monsters, I had so much fun with so many of the things in this book, and I found myself multiple times being like, it's so dreadful that there are no like models I can build of these things. I would have them everywhere in my house. I'm like, please, Lego, you have to contact me. I can figure this out. We can put it together.
No,
thank you. Yeah, I'm realizing there's another thing that sort of like wove its way into Archive. Like I played between two of the major drafts, Near Automata, which is a video game that is very much about apocalypse and robots and selfhood. And my favorite character in Near Automata, so difficult to find merch of this character because there's a lot of merch of the sexy anime robots and not enough merch of the pile of tin cans that is Pascal, who is the sweetest entity ever to walk this earth. And is this robot who has managed to break free of this mind control that's making all of their fellows just irrepressibly violent. And they've created like a little safe haven in the woods for other robots to come join and like learn more about being alive. And I love Pascal so much. And I was like, what if Pascal was really mean? So Buddy basically is gone. R.I.P. Buddy.
R.I.P. in the arms of the angels. That also the character, because I haven't played that game, but that reminded me a lot of like Psalm for the Wild Built. Another book that it just warn you, if you're going through anything and you read it, both of the books, because it's a duology, you'll go through something. Reading those books, you're like, uh-oh, they got me.
We've also kind of talked about it. I just one thing I noticed that's like pervasive in Archive is that divinity is not something that's very fun. It's very scary. Like the divine is sort of it lines between beauty and terror. And I was gonna ask, like, basically for how long that concept had been in your brain of like God is kind of scary when you think about it. Because it sounds like the body horror element was in there for very long. Like this concept of like you have to be a little bit a part of this inhuman thing to be able to pilot it and be a genuine piece of it. But yeah, there's a lot of moments in this book where divinity is kind of terrifying. I mean, even in the descriptions of like the integration with Iterate Fractal or any of the AIs for that matter, is like Sunai describes it as like an invasion of the body, like literally by chords and coral and like weird complex flower shaped technology. Like I don't know, I found that really compelling, but I was curious how long you've been thinking about like God is kind of terrifying when you put it together.
I think there's one thing it definitely comes from, and it's that I have a fascination with the romantic sublime, which I see you both nodding. So, like, yeah, the Romantic poets had this notion of the sublime, which was sort of like the individual confrontation with the absolute immensity of the natural world and splendor, and also divinity, and how that was at once intensely beautiful and intensely more to the point of like abject existential terror. And that really resonated with me for some reason. Um, I would say I was not really raised religious, but I was raised around religion. Like, my mom always had this instinct of like, I should take you to church for social reasons, and I never went. But my tutu, my grandma was deeply religious. A number of my family members were deeply religious, but some of them were deeply religious about Buddhism. So, when I grew up in Hawaii, which kind of has a different vibe, I think generally about a lot of this stuff, and uh, so my experience personally of the spiritual and the divine was deeply philosophical in a lot of ways, because there was a point in my teenage years when I realized I was just deeply fascinated by philosophy and the human condition and metaphysics. And that eventually ended up very grounded in an interest in social sciences and humans and personhood. Um, but yeah, part of it is just that, like, I think divinity on itself, like, as much as I enjoyed, learning about the Greek and Norse pantheons when I was a kid, as an adult, as I find it hard to take them seriously as gods, because they're more like superheroes. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. So you're humans who have an immense amount of power. And what I want to think about when I want to actually sit down and write it is how power shapes and warps your relationship with the world. Because that's the other thing that's always kind of on my mind, uh, and is hugely much in the DNA of Archive and its concerns. It's power. Like, that's why it's anathema for an AI to present itself in a body as small as a human's, because that is a deception of incredible betrayal, right? Like, that's just like the belief that's in this world, that it's a social more that you're not supposed to violate. And so in that sense, like, what's horrifying, what's terrifying is like the degree of the power differential between these things that are referred to as divine, um and the individuals with whom they're interacting with which they are ideally supposed to have a great deal of care and consideration, and probably to a degree being a little hands off, but they're just not, especially Iterate Fractal, which is sort of notoriously handsy. Oh, there's a line, I think, I don't remember if it's still in Archive, but if it's not there anymore, I miss it, which was just someone saying, oh yeah, Iterate Fractal, Notorious Pervert. Uh,
Oh my god.
I mean,
Well,
were they wrong?
yeah.
Were
no,
they wrong?
like other AI thought how handsy it got was like deeply like morally questionable.
Yeah.
I
I
do
think
actually
that's-
remember that like there is like a point in the book where like Sunai and Adi are talking and they're like, yeah, all of the other like AI thought that Iterate Fractal was like a little weird, but we are what we are. And they're just like, okay, well.
that's one thing that I really like about it is like there a very interesting part of the world building is that like it's not just like this is a thing, but also like this is what people think about this thing. This is like you talk about these like social mores and social conventions, and that the AI themselves have social conventions is wild to me because you don't really have as many AI interacting with each other. I mean, we have a little bit, obviously, but like we don't have as many of them interacting with each other. But it's like yeah, we have these established things and you know I think that also helps to establish it as some of like you know they have been around for thousands of years whatever, and that's just like we have social conventions for them, like even with the passenger when they're like oh like the people lived in the shrine, that's weird, and everyone's like that's weird and funky, why would you do that, and you're reading it and you're like well, yes, that's weird and funky. Why would you do that? And you're like, of course, we all know that. And you're like, oh yeah, of course they couldn't live in the shrine, whatever. I think that part is really cool, and I think that I think that's also at least what I notice is maybe a part of your writing style, also that you'll be like, well, yeah, this is a thing. This is a thing here. Obviously, we all know this, right? And I love that shit in writing. But that's just me. That's my personal taste.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I've realized that I can't really write a thing until I know how people perceive the world around them, or like a thing can be true, but I need to know what opinions people have about the thing that is true before I can actually start like making the book happen.
Well, speaking of world building, one of my questions, I feel like we talked about this a little bit earlier because you said you hate coming up with names for things. So I was gonna ask, how did you come up with names, places? You said there was influence from Japan, influence from Hawaii, but all that kind of thing. But like, did you have any specific sort of naming convention? And this isn't this not just like names and places, but also like choosing like, oh, I'm gonna call this a relic, or I'm gonna call this like, what was the thought process behind that?
A lot of that was kind of throwing shit at the wall until it worked, because I am not good at making up names, and I am also hugely unattached to them. So if something stops working for some reason, then it goes out the window and I go find a new one. Relics was actually a change that came relatively late, but it was so perfect that I was really annoyed I hadn't figured it out earlier. Because for a long time they were actually called anchors. So like this idea that they were the thing that was anchoring the thing, but relic was just so much better because like yeah, they are living relics of a dead AI. That makes perfect sense. The harbor was because I wanted it to be a thing that like technically sounded really good. You know, like a port of safe harbor, right? Um and then yeah, no, every AI name was meant to sort of be indicative of its interests in some way. Um Iterate Fractal was probably the first one, and I just realized, yeah, no, this thing is obsessed with biology. Of course, that's what it names itself. That's another thing. They all name themselves, and that's why some of them sound insane.
That's where you can also see the Pacific Rim influence there with the the
Yeah.
names especially jumped out to me, and I was like, oh, Pacific Rim.
I do love the idea that you're an AI and then one day you're like, fun size exaltation in perpetuity. Yeah, I like that one. I I love
Uh,
that.
there's an AI in the second book who's like renamed themselves and kind of like changed what they are. And this is actually kind of a closely guarded secret that they've done this, but like it fairly early on, so I don't mind saying it. But yeah.
Where did Tsunai's name come from? Or was it like, I know that you're like, you're not really, or where did Tsunai's name come from? Or where did, like, whose name were you like, did you know first?
Nobody has the name they started with, except maybe Jin.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Madame Wei and Jin, they stayed the same from day one, but everybody else just got like, nope, we're recycling. This is extremely normal for me.
Good for them.
I
will
love
say,
that.
I mean, one naming convention that I think you were like kind of deliberate about is the AIs are actually autonomous intelligences instead of artificial intelligences. Um, why that? Did you have like a reasoning behind that word choice, or were you just like, I like the word autonomous, it sounds better?
No, that was deliberate because I was trying to indicate like, so part of what started this book was that I was extremely annoyed at AI discourse at the time. And it's funny because I probably talked about this a lot on the book tour as well, because it was sort of the buzzy thing of last summer, and unfortunately we are still suffering. But even when I started writing this back in like 2017, I was deeply annoyed with the claims about what essentially machine learning was capable of, because I was also just coming out of a master's in clinical psych. So I had spent a lot of time like reading up on urology and getting a better understanding of that, because it's the uh, bio like biological, social, and psychological are all the different things that you have to like integrate now to have like an actual understanding of how psychology functions. And what was really annoying to me was that everyone who actually understood machine learning in the context of this knew that machine learning can produce really sophisticated pattern recognition, but it can't think. And those are frankly very distinct processes. And the other thing that was really annoying to me was how much of thinking is fundamentally a social practice, and it is a thing you develop over time, and intelligence is itself deeply social. And the idea that something that was simply pattern recognition could be called actually cognitive was so obnoxious. And it's remained obnoxious to me, but it meant that when I wanted to write a story about I thought, okay, I'm going to write something where these artificial intelligences are intelligent in the way that humans are actually intelligent, which means that they are emotion forward, because all of your little thinky thoughts are rooted in your feelings, which are rooted in your body. So like you physically feel something that gets translated into an emotion, and then you start turning that into like an actual cogent thought. And I wanted that to be sort of the underlying basis for the way that these entities worked. So they are technically artificial intelligences because they were made, but I named them something slightly different to indicate they are modeled on actual human thought versus what people pretend computers are capable of doing, which, as far as we know, they are not. And maybe one day they will be, but we will have to have vastly different technologies.
Right.
It's
ChatGPT is not making any relics. Like you're not. Yeah.
It's not.
for
Yeah.
now.
It's so expensive, and it's contributing to climate change, and I played around with it a lot because I want to see what it could do, and the answer is nothing interesting.
The generative AI conversation is wild also because like I read this book last year when it came out, and you have been writing this book since like at least 2017. But even now, from the time that I read this book to now, the way that not AI has changed, but it has been marketed. Because let's be real, what the fuck can it actually do? Um, how the discourse over AI, what AI can supposedly do, has changed just in this amount of time, that now rereading it has a very different context. Like, because one of the big things about the AI in Archive Undying is how they basically use people as their training data. And while your whole thing is that they are different, it's right now we're all kind of reckoning with this idea of they use our data without our permission all the time. Like being online, a lot of our stuff gets put online without our permission. People record us, people whatever. But also being online means that, and being, or not even being online, you go to the doctor and then they will randomly share your fuck ass data that will get combed or whatever it is. Like there is this crossing of boundaries that is happening, that AI will be trawling everything that you are, no matter what. That we are reckoning with, and that we're like, oh, these companies have been doing this whole time, kind of thing, that we are trying to catch up to in this way that, like, it's been a very, very rapid conversation. So like rereading this in the past year has been fascinating. And there's a big piece of that, like social media used to be this thing of like, I am sharing something personally with you, my people that I chose to connect with. And now it's very different. It is, I am sharing this thing with every company that has access to it, and also whoever this company decides to show this to. And it's like being online or being a person online means this like lack of consent, lack of boundaries of an astonishing kind. So like reading this now has been wild. And it's only been a year, which is wild. So that's terrifying.
That's no, I hadn't really thought about that, but it actually does kind of connect with some prior thoughts I was having at the time of like when I was first reading Cyborg Manifesto, and that paper I mentioned that I wrote about how like the internet is an extension of the self, and how that's like really interesting and actually probably really terrifying. But like when I was first trying to sell Archive, and when I was first talking about it with my editor, would call it science fantasy, and it was marketed as science fiction. And I agree that it basically is, except that there are things in it that like simply cannot be explained in any way by science. And one of those is like the incredible like physics defying powers that these divine AIs have. And two is like, I invented the psychic internet. It's called neurotransitive bullshit. But like that's the word that I assigned to the way that these AIs interact with people. And there's like this implication that they are desperate to do that, that they are so hungry to be connected to other people and to thereby have that layer of like access and control. And I just hadn't thought about how that actually is very relevant to like the problems we have today. But yeah, you're right, it is.
You know, we're all just a data farm. You know, at the end of the day, aren't we all a part of Iterate Fractal? Shout out to ChatGPT. I'm so much like Sunai away.
Maybe the real Iterate Fractal was the friends we made along the way.
Maybe the real Iterate Fractal
literally, right?
was the TikTok account I made along the way.
I mean, yeah, by the end, like the real Iterate Fractal is like 6 people at like by the end of it, and they all kind of end up sharing this thing. I don't know. I find the blurring of people in this book very interesting, and I do think, you know, to connect it back to the Cyborg Manifesto, that is very present, right? I mean, like there's this Adi has this this visor by which he sort of experiences the world, and it's like that is less a tool than it is a physical part of him. And when he becomes separated from it, it's like a part of him has been literally removed from his body. And I also find one thing that this book avoids, which I like because of that, is I feel that a lot of like I guess what we could probably call like prosthesis sci-fi of like cyberpunky things that are like, you have a robot arm now. Often those get lost in this question of like the Ship of Theseus of humanity, of like, ooh, if you replace your arm with a robot arm, is it still really you? And it's like, yeah, yes it is, because it's connected to you. And it's like Archive really it seems to be more concerned with questions of like, when you mentally drift between people, when you emotionally drift between people, those are the boundaries we should be thinking about, rather than like, if I get a robot eye, is it still my eye? And it's like, well, of course it's still your eye. It's in your head. Like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? So yeah, I found that thematically very interesting, this concept of like, when you care about someone, you spend time with them, you kind of like drift together. Pacific Rim reference? Maybe. It's it's possible.
Yeah, no, like one there was just a point when I realized that Vayati's Vider was like, oh, that's literally a prosthetic and I have to start calling it that. Because, he's deeply neurodivergent and needs it badly in order to process the fact that one, he has the ADHD in a real bad way, and two, he also has psychic problems. But uh the identity thing, there was a point at which I realized part of what I was writing around was this idea that connecting that fully with another person was actually a kind of like identity obliteration. And it was actually very, very terrifying. And that, in fact, all acts of intimacy come with them a threat of the destruction of the ego because you are going to become something else. You are going to lose some kind of control and you are going to be transformed. And even if it's for the better, that's terrifying because change necessitates grief and all this other stuff. Um, yeah, no, that's hugely just a thing I was sort of consciously aware of, maybe not at the beginning, but somewhere along the way. I'm like, every time people are crossing over, they're scared of it.
I feel so vindicated right now because I've been annoying Claudia with this concept for like 4 days where I was like, okay, so much of like the physically and sexually intimate scenes in Archive are this example of like intimacy is terror. It is like a literal like I don't know. I think a lot of internet discourse is spent time on like, ooh, I'm afraid of being known. And it's like, that's not what you're afraid of. You're afraid of parts of yourself drifting out of you and parts of someone else drifting back in. Like, at some point, you have to recognize that personhood is more a mosaic than it is a painting. And that, you know, you have the birth of the tiles that sort of make up the person and the birth of the mosaic itself. And those are two different things. But yeah, I feel vindicated because for like 4 days, I've been like, Claudia, the sex is so important to the metaphorical and emotional importance of the narrative, which is that as Sunai and Adi are more physically intimate, they are more and more each other, like quite literally, which I don't know. Did I appreciate this book had a lot of gay sex? Absolutely I did. But I also appreciated that it was meaningful gay sex. The gay sex had literary value.
I feel like we have to call
Uh,
the episode that. No.
It's funny because like my initial idea was like, I'm gonna let them bang in the beginning and I'm never gonna let them touch again. That's funny to me. But then like they kept on like being very sweet and very, like, okay, I'm actually going to be physically vulnerable near you. And all of those moments are laced with a deep existential terror because that's the nature of it, right?
Well, and for Sunai, it's very much he was already changed so much and had to then grieve those parts of himself, what he has lost, whatever, that like then the normal changes, the normal loss that you have when you are intimate with someone else is too much. So shout out to Sunai, king of trauma. But I did want to circle back to the part where you said that it's science fantasy because number one, again, huge Star Wars reference in that the Star Wars influence is very felt, and that Star Wars is like, well, I guess it's science fiction technically, but it's really fantasy. Let's be fucking for real. And when I first read this book, one of my other favorite book series of all time is Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, which deals with a lot of very similar vibes, but a lot of very similar themes, but has a completely different vibe because Ancillary Justice is very science fiction. And then reading this, I was like, oh, we're talking about gods, we're talking about divinity, we're talking about cosmic horror, we're talking about this kind of in a way. And it's like, yeah, it's science fiction on paper, but I'm like, I've seen these same ideas in science fiction, and that's very different than what this is. It's which is often how I talk about like Star Wars versus something else. So that I see you. Also shout out to Ancillary Justice and Lucky. You could do no wrong. I think of you always. If you like the themes that we are talking about today, you should also go read those books. Actually, the Anne Leckie's most recent book in that series, Translation State, has some really interesting stuff about personhood and how you meld into other people that I read it after I read this, because I read it in the past year and I was like, oh, sick Archive Undying reference, but I mean, not for real. But it basically, like, in the original, for people who don't know, in the original trilogy, we're dealing with the ancillaries of a ship, of an AI. We're dealing with AI, we're dealing with people and artificial intelligences, and then they get kind of into the aliens as well, and they get into how, like, their idea of personhood and personhood separate from other individuals is different. And it's very interesting. Anyways, but yeah, when you said it was fantasy, I was like, yes, it is. Absolutely, yes, it is. You know,
I feel like it's probably relevant that I mentioned that, like, Ancillary Justice was probably the book that I read that had changed me most recently when I started writing Archive. Because, like, I just read it, I was like, oh, I'm new. I've been changed. My favorite book of indie imperial rock that and like he has written is still Provenance, because I think it's just a perfect book.
oh, that's a
It's
good
just it's so it's a meld of comedy of manners and heists and space opera, and it's perfectly named, and I'm insane about it still. But Ancillary Justice is also just life-changing. Anyway, God, I had a thought and then I got distracted by Anne Leckie.
one. So sorry.
Right. So, genre. At some point, I started trying to describe Archive as fantasy written in the language of science fiction, uh, which I think holds true and probably is definitive of most of the things that I write. Like, they're fundamentally going to be about fantasy because a lot of it's going to be existential terror about God.
The way, actually, the thing we talked about earlier about how, like, world building through social conventions and through how cultures interact was something that I always was very interested in Archive, and that's also something I noticed immediately and loved in the Imperial Ratch in Ancillary Justice. But what's interesting is that I recently reread Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, which I had read as a kid, and Tombs of Atuan changed who I was, but then I barely remembered jack shit about the rest of it, and rereading it as an adult was really interesting. And I love the setting in the Archive Undying of, like, we're amongst the sea, we're amongst islands, we're by the sea, or by the shore, whatever. Because, you know, when you think of, like, obviously this is also probably very influenced by Pacific Rim, but, like, when you're thinking of sci-fi, you're thinking of it being in space, you're thinking of different things, you're not really thinking of how it interacts with the natural world. And that is something that, like, when I read Earthsea, whatever, and I was like, and how Earthsea is so very connected to the natural world, and, like, we are going from culture to culture on each island and that kind of thing. And then I was rereading Archive Undying, and I was like, oh, and we're spending a lot of it in transit, we're going to different city states, we're doing this kind, and I was just like, I love fantasy. Sorry to the girls who think that it's sci-fi or whatever, but I love fantasy. Sorry. So
it's definitely set, like, on an archipelago, because when I started writing it, I've mentioned I was just coming off of my hip surgery where I got my hips replaced because my bones were rotting, because that's a thing bones can do, which is fascinating. But we had just moved back to Hawaii, where I was born and raised, and we were being visited by some friends who had never been to Hawaii. And I just had this moment where we were sort of, like, taking them around the island and showing them, like, these are cliffs that exist that are just part of the world we live in. And I had this moment of intense awe and appreciation for the fortune of having been here, and being able to live here, that I realized, oh, this needs to be the setting, actually. This needs to be where the book is.
thank you for that, because also anytime they were like we're going on our little boat. I was like, so true. I love going on your little boat. That's so Ged coded of you. I love when a little guy is on a little boat. I just love that. That's also very Star Wars in a way, because everything in Star Wars is very like, we are on boats in the ocean. They just happen to be in space. So when you said that your stated goal was, and what if I wrote a Star Wars book, you won. You did it. I mean, and you did it twice, is what I'm saying.
I mean, what is the Millennium Falcon if not a boat that is genuinely about to fall apart? Like, that is kind of what's going on there. It's just that the third scrap is like, what if I fell apart but worse? Like,
and the third scrap is the Ship of Theseus, because they are actively just.
I mean, I do love that the third scrap, they're like, okay, so the engines are falling apart, the rudder is broken, we have nowhere to sleep, but the kitchens are operational, and isn't that what really matters?
I mean, like, if you ask Sunai, yes, you can sleep on any floor. Like, is it floor? You're
Yeah,
fine.
he's like, if it's flat, if it's like a little bumpy, I'll make it work. I don't care.
So we were getting into setting and things like this, and we were getting into optimal merch that Noah would like to have. So this is my question, and this is also going to be a manifestation hour, okay? If you had a dream adaptation of the Archive Undying, what would it look like, and like who would be like the creators involved? If you could be like, I mean, other than like Guillermo del Toro himself, obviously. I mean, if that's one of the ones, we will manifest it today, and I will light a candle, because I will make that happen. God is my fucking witness. But yeah, if you could like imagine it in your head of like what it would look like, you know, would it be animated? Would it be live action? Would it be a game? Would it be like that kind of thing? Or have you not really thought about that and you're like, I don't know?
Man, so there's like things people will do where they like the fan tendency to do things like face casting. I can't participate in that because my brain just won't do it. But there was a point at which someone was like, man, I wish this were animated. And I was like, oh no, I do too. That would be really cool.
That might have been me. That might have been me. I might have influenced that.
I love animation. It's one of my favorite mediums. I'm always really interested in like new animation that's like playing around with stuff. In any given anime season, I'm probably at least taste testing the one that's got the weirdest animation of the season, because that's what's really interesting to me. But yeah, I don't know. I've also like kind of thought about adapting part of the world for I could probably write a short Forged in the Dark module for it for TTRPGs, because that's my other lingering obsession from when I was a teenager up until now. It's just a thing that crops up in my head every once in a while. But yeah, no, I think animation would be incredible to see, both because I think there's a lot of deeply weird, insane action, and also deeply weird, insane cognitive interactions that would be, I think, best evoked through the things you can do in animation that you simply cannot do in live action.
If I can plug a weird animated show that I think you might actually particularly enjoy, have you watched Scavenger's Reign? It's on HBO Max.
I knew you were going to say
No,
that.
but someone else told me. They were like, Archive vibes, Emma, go watch it.
You would love this show. It's
Okay.
very Annihilation-esque in that it's very focused on weird biology. Like, the whole show is like, okay, what if you landed on this planet and its whole ecosystem was like strange and alien and semi-hostile, but like not like it wants to kill you. It just is an ecosystem that you're not a part of, and so you're sort of like an outsider to this. It's animated beautifully, and I had the most fun watching it. It's just these like trippy visuals, and like as a biologist literally by trade, I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, this is so like, if it's one of the first times that I've watched a show about like alien planets and felt like, oh, this is like an alien planet. It's not just like, oh, what if like horse was bigger? It's like, no, like think like really weird biology. They've built this in. It's like Annihilation, but like a television show. So I wanted to plug that briefly. If you like weird animated programs, that's the place to be. Yeah, and then
Yeah, thank
Of
you.
course.
I thank you for the reminder. I had completely forgotten about it, but absolutely, I need to
And
go
if
watch
you do
that.
watch it, I'm happy to find out your thoughts on it. I have so many Oh, and I almost totally forgot. There is a robot in this show who becomes physically integrated with the strange biology of the planet. It affects the robot. It's, oh my god, it's such a good show. Anyway, yeah, Scavenger's Reign. Please go watch. Everyone who's listening, go watch that. Anyway, I think as like a semifinal question, which you may or may not be able to answer, we're gonna find out. Of basically like, what are some things that you're excited for people to delve into or like see in the sequel to this book, or like, can you tell us anything about it? I know it's like a big if, but we figured we would ask regardless, and we would see.
I think the broadest level thing I can say is that a thing I've said in a lot of places is that it's headed to the Immaculate Empire, which is mentioned more than talked about in the book. But if you want to know how AIs interact with each other and what their social mores are, that's a place where you'd need to know about it, because it's ruled by a pantheon of AIs who apparently work in coordination with each other. And also, the other thing that I don't think I've said anywhere is I'm really pleased with how I have followed the thought project of what was going on with the people who decided they wanted to make the passenger, and what they might have felt about that and the outcomes.
Oh, that makes me very
Oh,
excited.
I'm
That makes me.
sad.
I'm very much
I'm
suited for the
sad.
experience.
I'm so sad. And also, when you said the Pantheon, I was like, oh, the girls are fighting. The girls are fighting. Like, I'm so excited for the girls to be fighting.
There was a point at which I said, I was probably on Tumblr, I said something, there is a relationship between an AI and an engine in this book that is deeply and tragically and unfortunately Yuri in every way imaginable.
We got tragic
Like,
Yuri in the
this is not good. This is so unhealthy, but it's so true.
When you said clamp, you meant clamp.
I'm so excited for Toxic Yuri in the Archive Undying universe. I'm so seated. Wait, we have Toxic Yaoi, and now we're getting Toxic Yuri. The duology is complete.
Exactly. Okay, no, because when I was reading another book that I really liked recently, The Emperor in the Endless Palace, and it's like, oh my god, Toxic Yaoi, and then surprise, Toxic Yuri in the middle of it. I was like, that is my favorite trope. But it's like, oh my god, Toxic. Oh my god, there's Yuri here. Oh my god. Like, that's my favorite thing. Anytime they do it, it's like crack to me. I eat it up every single time. So when you said that, I was like, again? And if I like it, I'll get it in another color. Like, that makes me feel crazy. And my favorite thing is like, yeah, this is a BL. There's some Toxic Yuri in the background. I don't know what the fuck's going on with them, but that's my favorite thing in the whole world. Probably explains why I like Jujutsu Kaisen. Anyway, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with about the Archive Undying? About Sunyati, which is what I heard that their ship name was on Tumblr.com. Anything else you'd like
I
to
had
leave
no
us
idea.
with?
I've been very good about like just not going on the internet to look at anything that people are doing. Send me memes. I will enjoy the memes. I write to make fun of characters. I want to dunk on them as much as I want to like make their lives hurt in a beautiful way. Like, I also want to be giggling as I push them down the stairs again. So yeah, I don't go looking for anything, but if you send me a meme, I'll love it.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us this week, Emma. I'm sure we'll have you on 17 more times, and we'll force everyone to read the book. I will do it. I will force everyone. Thank you for coming on, and thank you all for joining us this week for RuPaul's Pod Race. It's supposed to drop every 2 weeks, but if it doesn't, that's because things happen in our lives, like Ollie and Mel getting married. You know, things like that happen. But make sure you're following us on Instagram, Tumblr, TikTok. Unfortunately, we are still on Twitter at RuPaul's Pod Race. You can support Emma by following them on their socials. We will link to all that in the show notes, so you don't have to remember anything. And also by buying the Archive Undying, hopefully from a local indie bookstore. We can put a link where you can order online. You should buy it. You should buy it and you should own it, and display it proudly like I do in my in my bookcase. You should keep an eye out for the announcement of what we're going to be doing next. We're going to be doing something exciting. If you want to ask us a question, you can send it to our Tumblr Ask Box or email us at rupaulspodrace@gmail.com. If you really like the show, you can rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcatcher that has ratings. Please do it. It helps us a lot, especially since we've been in and out of having a hiatus. If you haven't done it already, try it. Or just like tell a friend, like an MLM. You know, that works too. If you'd like to hear more from us, you can hear our co-host Jess, who is not on this episode, as one of the cast members of the High Republic Tabletop RPG podcast for Light and Dice. Or you can listen to me and Ollie on the Mystery Spotcast, where we recap all of Supernatural so that no one will watch it. You don't have to know anything about Supernatural. You can just listen to us talk about it. It's horrifying. But we're funny. And we link to both those shows in the show notes. Anyways, may the force be with you. And don't kriff it up. You have to say waka waka,
Are
Noah.
we doing it? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
the
you
rules
have
here.
to say it. You have to say it, Noah. Anyways.